So excited to host again, Dr. Dylan. That's what I'll call you because I know that's what most people call you, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes. And you've become our kind of partner in mental
hmm
health. And we have a long-standing relationship with Birch Psychology. And uh, shout out to Aus and their whole team, and
hmm
especially Dylan for offering this service to our community. It's really important. Getting kids into college is one thing, having them thrive when they get there is another. And
hmm
a part of
Absolutely.
our belief and philosophy is that parents really need to be a big part of that conversation. I don't think in our culture we honor enough this incredible transition from having a child from birth to high school 18, and then suddenly they're gone.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of emotions come with that, and a lot of emotions come as the between 16 and 18, and then also when the students are gone. I also just want to call out that I just got back from a sprint run. So I am bright red and sopping wet. But if you are in need of some encouragement of taking care of yourself, let me model that for you. So there we go on that. Dylan, I want you to go ahead and just introduce yourself, and then we
Mhm.
do have some questions that have come through. And let's just get started.
Lovely. Yeah. So I'm Dr. Dylan Larson-Konar. I wanted to introduce myself just in the context of this conversation and sort of where I'm coming from in terms of working with adolescents and college students. So of course myself was a college student a long time ago transitioning. Since that point, I've worked at two different college counseling centers at the University of Florida and then also at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where I imagine some parents have children going to or wanting to go. And then right now I work at Birch Psychology as a postdoctoral fellow, and I'm currently working with some college students and also with a fair number of sort of late adolescents. So around like 16 to 18, and have been working with them as they've moved to a point where they're going to get ready to go to college or are starting to think about it as well.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to dive in.
Sure.
Dylan, is there like a roadmap for preparing kids and parents emotionally and
Mhm.
mentally for the transition to college?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question a lot as I work with my clients. I would say that right now, for students who are about to go to college in say August or maybe September, the task is one of sort of building autonomy and being sort of at a place where you can feel more independent and more autonomous from your parents. So then the task is really less about like a parent doing something necessarily to emotionally prepare their child and more about sort of this joint task of sort of letting go, which I think can be equally difficult. And you talked about this not being something that we talk enough about in our culture. And I think that that process of sort of letting go is another thing that we probably don't talk enough about in our culture. And what's difficult, I think, is there's an aspect where you have to sort of let your child struggle a little bit through this process, potentially feel some discomfort, while also sort of preparing them or creating like a sense of scaffolding around what it might be like. So, just to offer a kind of a quick example of this that I've seen be effective is that rather than, for example, calling the counseling center for your child, telling them who they are, setting up the appointment for your child, talking about your concerns, maybe that looks more like talking to your child, figuring out maybe that's something that they want, giving them sort of the website or asking them, is this something that you've thought about? And then giving them space to make those decisions themselves. So I think a lot of what emotionally preparing your child looks like is sort of stepping up in the sense of course, like maintaining that care for them and sort of thinking ahead for them to a certain degree, but then also stepping back. And I think for a lot of parents, that stepping back is actually the harder part than the stepping up.
We Hannah, maybe we can add later, but we have a launch checklist, because I think part of what you're talking about is like we can be doing that now, but in some ways I think it has to start like 2 years earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And so we created a little checklist for our families that's like, are your kids making their own doctor's appointments? Are they advocating at school for needs, and doing that gradually so it's not like a big shock
Yeah.
later. So I really appreciate what you're saying. I think one of the things that I've noticed, and especially
Mhm.
since COVID, is students aren't leaving home as much before. They're not getting
Yeah.
practice. It seems like summer camps aren't kids don't go to summer camp as much, and there's not like go stay with your grandma for a month like when I was growing up. And so I am hearing a lot of students homesick.
Hmm.
Advice on that?
Yeah. Well, one is I just want to reiterate that point that you made about sort of preparing almost like 2 years in advance for some of that points. Because I think that that's like at this stage when your child is late 17 or 18 and they're actually going to college, a lot of what you're doing is relying on sort of the modeling or the lessons that you've implanted up to this point, rather than really doing anything active right now. So, in terms of advice for homesickness, if I can kind of go back a couple of years, one piece is that one thing that I really see a lot with college students is just stuff around avoidance, whether that's like emotional avoidance or not feeling comfortable feeling their feelings, or things like avoiding scheduling that doctor's appointment. To get to your point of homesickness, maybe it's like avoidance of reaching out and trying to find a new community, which could be something that would really like help bolster that sense of homesickness. And the students that I see that are often the most successful are those that have this sort of instinct where if they feel a sense of fear or discomfort or anxiety, they're able to sort of identify maybe where that's coming to, and then they take steps to approach that. So there's a lot of ways to model that, right? Like if your child or student is sort of nervous about something, whether it be like a summer camp or something smaller, uh, providing support, but then encouraging them to actually do the thing that they are then afraid of, and then modeling that in yourself. So that's one thing that I think is really preventative for homesickness. In terms of initial steps, I would say like that homesickness is really, really normal and typical, especially, I don't know if we have any international parents or parents of international students, but especially in that case, it's like very normal. And if it's something that your child is talking about or worried about for like 1, 2, 3 months, it's just not something I'd be particularly concerned about. If it's still that we're talking like 6 months, or if we feel like they're isolating, then I'm going to be more concerned. But I think that again, like supporting them, calling them, talking them through that, connecting them friends, maybe from high school, maybe fall break is a time where they can sort of get sort of like reintegrated a little bit into their sort of high school friend community. But I think that discomfort is like pretty normal and also maybe beneficial, because that's often what leads people to then push out and do some things that might be out of their comfort zone, whether it's like joining a club or whether it's sort of sitting down to someone else at lunch and introducing themselves. So a lot of those things for some students, especially more introverted students, they just don't happen unless they feel some homesickness or unless they feel some anxiety. So yeah, I would just say that it's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of like warning signs for real
I was
concerns.
actually just going to ask you that, because there's like a fine line, right?
Right,
There's
definitely.
like, okay, you're doing okay. I actually, as a parent, when my kids went to college, I was so overtrained on like letting them go that I
Yeah,
think sometimes I wasn't paying attention to some of the
yeah,
warning signs, because
totally.
I was like, you got it, you can do it, you don't need me.
Right,
I'm the parent who launches great kids. And
right,
then
right.
like what is the difference between that anxiety that's good and the anxiety that's not good? And how do we
Yeah.
know from far away?
Yeah, right. And yeah, it can be hard to know from far away. And then everyone has really different routines about how they, like, for example, would like call or FaceTime their child during college. I mean, one thing is like setting up a regular time, maybe like once a week, where you're doing that and you're checking in. Another thing would be like trying to figure out ways of contacting your student in case something like that were to happen, so you would know. So maybe that looks like getting the numbers of roommates. Um, I was also an RA, like a resident assistant, when I was a junior and senior when I was an undergrad. And we tended not to have direct communication with parents, but we're like working for the student. In a lot of ways, your RA is like the first responder
Mm.
to your student. So like, for example, if a student was like drunk to the point of being incapacitated, I'm the one who's going to send them to the hospital. Or if a student is isolating in their room for like a week at a time, I'm going to be the one to know. And then I notified, for us, it was the director of student life. So finding out like who that person is for your student or for your child in their school. And then you're probably not going to be able to talk directly to the RA, just because those positions they're sort of like shielded from managing parents, just because that's a lot of extra work for them.
Full-time
But
job.
yeah, right, exactly. But they're going to report to someone else who's part of the administration. And then that person is also going to be a point person that you can have their email or their phone number. And if you are concerned, they might be a point of checking in. Um, I would say you're right that that line is really hard, right? And it's going to be different and context based for each student. Um, we talked about sort of like healthy anxiety or healthy stress, and that's the kind of stress that might push your student to do something that is empowering for them, or sort of like it creates more independence or creates more community. And then often I can see with when I work with people who might reach that level of like clinical anxiety or clinical depression, that there's a little bit of a sort of vicious cycle going on. So for example, a student is so anxious that they feel as if they kind of aren't going to interact with anyone, or they're not going to go to that next event. And that's sort of happening. And then in doing so, maybe they feel like a loss of community, which then sort of saps their energy. And you can kind of see where you would hope that that would push them forward, but instead it seems to be pulling them back. And if you're sort of noticing that pattern of that vicious cycle enough, that's when I would start to be concerned. And by enough, I think I just mean a certain amount of time.
I think what I like about what you're saying is that, I mean, it actually goes back to what you're saying is build in some systems from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I think the communication piece, like at least I want to hear from you once a week.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so different. When I went to college, like we had a telephone.
Right.
And
Right.
no, my parents didn't even expect me to call them. Like I went to school and then maybe I called them a couple times. Then I went home for Thanksgiving. And
Right.
now I think parents may have the expectations that their students would be in close touch, and they don't hear from their kids and they get kind of anxious.
Right.
And so it's hard for us to know because we don't know what's happened. We don't even know what's happening.
Right.
So I guess not hearing from kids would be a pretty big red flag if they don't respond to you at all.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they're responding too much, that could be, if they're constantly calling you, that could be a red flag. But what about, how do we tease through, like, are there specific questions that could
Mm-hmm.
lead us to, because I really appreciate what you're saying, but it felt like if I were a parent, I'd be like, how would I even know that that's happening to my student?
Yeah, right. And I think that it is more limited, right? Like your knowledge of it. And I think having maybe certain expectations around calling or around like how frequently that is, when are we checking in, is one way to actually know. I think one answer is that you're probably just like not going to know as much. And that's part of that. Like you said that like in a lot of ways you were encouraged to let go more. And I think I'm imagining that different parents are at different places on that spectrum.
Yeah.
So I think knowing less is going to be part of that discomfort for parents, that like they might just have to manage in the same way that the child has to manage more anxiety. In terms of specific questions, I mean, I would be curious about, I'll lump this into 3 different categories based on a psychological theory I like. It's called self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is based a lot on the development of sort of intrinsic or internal motivation to sort of succeed. And it's interested in 3 different broad categories. One's autonomy, one's relatedness, and one's competence. So this is like you can kind of think about this almost as like a checklist. So with relatedness, I'm going to be asking about or thinking about like their relationship to their roommate, their relationship to other friends, their feeling of connectedness potentially to like classmates or to professors or to TAs, and the extent to which they're feeling as if like that they sort of care about me and I care about them. That's probably the number one thing I'm going to pay attention to. The next is more academic, and that gets around competence, which is, do they feel like they have like the ability to sort of master the content that they want to academically? That also may be like different things in their own life. So like maybe they're not comfortable with laundry, but do they feel as if they can sort of like take steps to get to that point where they can do it, And that gets to the last point of autonomy, which is like the ability to feel like you can sort of control your own path in life. And they're like, as they're freshmen, they're not going to feel like that initially, but if you can see sort of growth in that, that's another thing I'd be paying attention to for a student, is like how much control do they have? How much control do they perceive that they have over the different elements of their life? Because when that's at 0, that's when we see things like learned helplessness. If people are familiar with that, that's sort of this idea of you feel helpless to resolve the different conflicts or situations in your life. And then even when you actually can resolve them to such an extent, you sort of learn that you can't or perceive that you can't, that you then don't take steps to even try. And that would be sort of like the bottom end of that feeling of autonomy. So that hopefully that offers a little bit of a guide, but you're right. It's hard to know. And as your student distances, I wouldn't be shocked if they like offered less, in terms of how things are going. than they might have before. Uh, though it's hard to say, because often I see students when they're seniors in high school are actually pulling away more from their parents and are providing more resistance. And then once they get to college, the natural distance that college provides sometimes actually improves those relationships, or actually makes a student like more interested in talking to the parent or providing more, because I think that they feel less of like a pull to actually separate, because they are separated already. So it can just go in a lot of different directions.
I love that. That self-determination there, that is really helpful, because that gives a framework,
Mm-hmm.
and it gives a framework for questions to ask. If you're on that call with your your child on a Sunday evening, asking questions like, not so much like, how are the classes?
Yeah.
But more like, do you feel prepared for the classes that you're in? Do you feel like your high
Yeah.
school prepared you? How do you feel like you're managing your time?
Yeah.
So instead of being like, how are you? Or, how are the classes, to get more specific in
Yeah.
the question asking. I'm thinking even that around competence, like the academic question, but also like, just curious, have you done laundry yet?
Yeah.
Ha ha ha. Or, when do you think you're going to do that? Just more out of fun, not like trying to be a nag. And then the relation piece too. I
Mhm.
think asking questions like, hey, have you ever taken time? Tell me about a professor that you've met. Or,
Yeah.
or do you ever have a chance to go out to dinner with your professors? Like
Mhm.
maybe asking really specific questions. It reminds me, actually, I was a kindergarten teacher for years, and I used to teach my parents, don't ask, what did you have a good day, to a kindergartner.
Mhm.
Instead, say, who did you sit next to?
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
did you, what book did your teacher read today? What was the song that you sang? So in some ways, and I've said this for so long, that mentoring high schoolers is not that different than mentoring kindergartners.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really just a different level of that building autonomy, right?
Right. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
self-determination and competence and all of that. And the whole point of being a parent is to get them to the point where we can launch them, where they get to play in a bigger field. And when
Yeah.
we play in a bigger field, it's going to be harder. You have
Yeah.
to have more stamina. You have to use those muscles in a new way, which means there's going to be times that are going to be rough.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's great points. I think that especially for the first like 6 months of freshman year, I think the highs are higher than normal, and I think the lows are sometimes lower. So like I think that if they feel loneliness like they hadn't experienced before in high school, but it's like they feel that for a night, and then the next morning they're feeling better, or even for a couple days. Like I'm not, that to me is just part of going to this new community. That's, you're probably gonna feel more lonely, but then also like that's sometimes or often paired with like a sense of excitement. And hopefully there's like excitement around classes, there's an excitement around being able to control their own schedules, there's like an excitement around like living around so many different peers. um so I see both of those things to your point.
It brings up for me, in some ways, no matter what learning profile your student
Mhm.
has, that really it might be advantageous to front load some of these things, and
Yeah.
to say this. Like, I never thought about ever saying that to my kids, like, hey, I want you to know that you should expect to feel highs and lows.
Yeah.
You should expect to be like, I'm on top of the world, I have the best friends in the world, and then you like crash when you don't get
Yeah.
invited, or you don't get the bid for sorority or fraternity that
Yeah.
you
Oh yeah.
wanted.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
kinds of things can really, I actually had, I won't get too into it, but somebody that I knew who did not get into the sorority that she wanted, and she left the school within a
Oh
week.
wow. Yeah.
And it's hard to put yourself out there and to not be accepted, and to be
Yeah.
able to, like, as you said, like, readjust. I will make a quick call out to this. You can get these on Amazon, Talking College Card Deck.
Oh cool.
And this is created by the woman who we're actually going to be interviewing her soon. I'm super excited. Her name is Andrea. Hannah, do you know her last name?
Malkin. Andrew Malkin.
Perfect. She did these cards, and she wrote a book called Doing College, or
Mhm.
something like that. And I think these are ones, again, maybe we should be talking about it earlier, not just a
Mhm.
month before college, but heck, why not? I mean, if I had
Yeah.
kids going to college, I'd probably have these on my table, because there's a whole bunch of things in there that do kind of front load and prepare that we might not, as parents, even remember.
Yeah.
And even psychologists might not be thinking about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
These little things, but sometimes it's those little details that can blow up in our face. And then we want to have those.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love those cards too. I have a similar sort of card deck for like different forms of therapy or coping strategies, and I find that like the cards are actually a lot more helpful than a book because they're just more accessible.
That's right, and that you can practice them more.
Yeah, totally.
Let's see. What about? Let's just assume we kind of get through that first beginning period. What about sustainability of mental health over time?
Yeah.
I mean, we've had incredible conversations in our this, I'm kind of calling it a podcast, even though it's not really a podcast, but it feels like a podcast.
Yeah.
Growing Good Humans. We actually interviewed an amazing expert in the field on Title IX. And she really addressed a lot about sex, alcohol, drugs, and the role that plays in mental health in college, and the kind of things that can happen when students are drinking and doing drugs. And man, that can really create some serious challenges. What's your psychology like? What we need another theory to help us through this.
Yeah. I was thinking about substances as we were having our initial conversation, because it's obviously a huge part of college. And high school students come into college with different levels of experience or different levels of use around alcohol and marijuana. In Colorado, I'm seeing a lot of high school students who are vaping nicotine really frequently, and who are also smoking marijuana or like eating it very frequently too. What's probably different there, though, is that there's not like an adult present to sort of like moderate that use. So, I don't know. I see a lot of college students, especially freshmen or sophomores, who have pretty problematic drinking, and then it resolves itself through time, but then also sometimes it doesn't resolve itself. And like a lot of college is weird with the norms. So like, I'm going to bring this up in two ways. One's with alcohol and one's with socializing. So with alcohol, there's such a norm around like partying and alcohol use, and like maybe like 6 or 8 drinks being normal, when we know that that's considered binge drinking and can be really harmful. But like being around it as a norm sort of, I think, really impacts the way that you drink and the way that you encounter substances. And there's this finding in social psychology. It's called pluralistic ignorance. It's this idea that like when people have an idea of a norm, then sometimes that will impact their behavior, even if the norm is wrong. So for example, in my undergrad, there was this idea that like people drank a lot. And then if you were to ask someone like, what's the percentage of students that really drink a lot on campus? People would probably say like 80-90% of students, but the number was actually like 50% when they were asking people. And like, because of that false norm, I think it actually increases drinking. Which could be a conversation with your student, or just something that they could be more aware of, is to sort of watch out for that. The other way this comes across is through socializing. It's a little bit different from your question, but I wanted to point it out from an earlier conversation we had. And it's that like when you're on college campus, it's easy to get the idea that everyone is always social constantly. And it's because when you're out and about, you're seeing people often who are also out and about. And what that can create is like an enhanced sense of loneliness, because you feel like, man, like everyone's always socializing, and like I'm not seeing as many people as other people are seeing. So it's another way in which sort of like a false norm gets in your head, and through social comparison, which we know among our teens and then college students is intense. It can make you feel as if you're more isolated than you actually may be. And in comparison to other students, maybe you feel like you're more lonely or more isolated than they are. And that's usually not the case. It's usually just a misperception of how often people are socializing.
Wow. I think a lot of students have some familiarity with that, just related to social media and that FOMO,
yes, totally.
FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. And it's so present everywhere. And here I am alone on a Friday night at college reading a book. And I think that's another way to kind of front load. Like, these are things that's like, I want all my students to know before they go, because it resets the norm, right? Because what is actually the perceived norm is not the perceived norm. And if students have maybe a self-talk around that, Like, I know that I feel lonely. I know that this is a feeling. I know that this feeling is maybe out of line compared to what is actually happening. I mean, I don't know, maybe you could give me the self-talk, because I'm not.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. It's sort of like, I'm having this feeling of loneliness. That feeling is like real, and I want to validate that in myself. Part of the reason I feel like this is I think that other students on campus are doing better than I am. I kind of know logically that that's not really true. So I want to like validate the feeling that I'm having, but like all the thoughts around it, I can identify as like, yeah, those are probably not true. And that like, it's okay for me to take time to myself if that's what I need. Or sometimes I don't get invited to stuff. That's okay. That's the norm, you know? And that like other students are also feeling the same way I am.
Do you, I'm thinking back to when I was parenting, and I used to say stuff to my kids like, be okay with saying no, but then I always tried to say let me help you what you can say yes to. So let's just say we're alone on a Friday night, and we have that feeling of loneliness. What's that next? Let's see, I'm going to see if I can get this right. What's the next? I mean, in that self-determination, it would be maybe just that ability to control your own life. So it would be autonomy, right? What would be the autonomous next move in one's thinking at that moment?
Yeah. Well, one thing I really liked helping students do, and it works for myself too, is like when I'm having that feeling, rather than trying to like fix it now, for example, by going to try and find out to do something, is to plan like a social activity into the future that I can then like look forward to. And then I often find that like really helps the feeling, or provides relief to that feeling now.
See, I would have
said often people are more likely to say yes to, because people are more likely to be like, oh, I can hang out, you know, in 4 days or tomorrow, as opposed to like, what are you doing right now? So I've had a little bit more success with that.
I really like that. Are you in a position to explain why that works better?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just think that I think it's more likely for people to say yes. I think that like often one way that like, and we're talking about just sort of normal loneliness here, but one way that depression works is when you're feeling really down, depression can convince you that the feeling you're having right now is going to last forever, and that it's also like broader and more global than it actually is. So maybe like you didn't get into your sorority, to use your example, and then maybe the thought is like, I'm alone, people don't like being around me, and that's going to be true for the rest of college. So if you can just do something into the future that sort of convinces you that what's happening now is actually quite specific and quite time limited, then it has a good way of just sort of cutting or like deflating that like natural expanding sense of like depression or anxiety. Because those emotions, those like tendencies will take up a lot of space if you sort of let them.
Wow, that's great. I just looked at my clock for the first time.
I know, likewise, yeah.
And it's 12:30. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that was so amazing. Dylan, can we plan our next session after this? You know, let's get our next topic on the books. Your input is so valuable. We are going to send this, Hannah, to all of our people who are leaving. And actually, I think we should send it to our students.
Yeah,
because I think even though we're kind of like, how do parents help? I think this is really valuable, specifically that self-determination piece. I think it's really valuable. And as always, we like to stop on time so we get people keep coming and watching. So we're so very grateful for you and everything that you do for our community. And we can't wait to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can't wait to join back.
And thanks, Hannah. I forgot to introduce you.
I'm good. I just sit here.
You're a very amazing moderator, and I always forget to introduce you and express my gratitude for you too. So thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Dylan.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.